There is a group of human beings whose DNA we learned to read before we knew what their faces looked like. For 15 years, we could measure how different they were from us. We could find pieces of them inside people alive right now. And still, nobody could tell you what they looked like walking down a street. That DNA didn't spread evenly. For millions of people today, it's a measurable part of who they are. For others, barely a trace. And where it shows up, and where it doesn't, turned out to be the biggest clue of all. All of it started with a piece of a finger bone. Most of us learned a fairly tidy version of where humans come from. Our species appears in Africa. We spread across the world. Neanderthals lose, they disappear. The end? It's a clean story. And for about 150 years it was close to the only story available. Because there was only one kind of evidence. Bones. If you wanted to know who lived somewhere 50,000 years ago, you needed a skull to measure, a jaw to compare, a skeleton complete enough to hold up against everything else you'd ever found. That was the entire toolkit, which meant something strange was quietly true the whole time. Any group of ancient humans who didn't leave behind enough bone, the right bone, in the right condition, in a place where it could survive, simply wasn't there. Not to science. They could have lived for hundreds of thousands of years across an entire continent, and we would never have known they existed at all. They wouldn't be a mystery. They'd be nothing. In the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, there's a cave in a limestone cliff. Locals call it Denisova Cave, named after a hermit who's said to have lived in it in the 1700s. A man named Dennis. The cave has an unusual quality. It stays cold and it stays dry almost all year round, and that combination does something remarkable. It protects DNA. Genetic material falls apart in heat and moisture. In a cold, dry cave, it can hang on for tens of thousands of years. Russian archaeologists have been digging there for decades. In 2008, they pulled out a fragment of a finger bone, the tip of a pinky, from someone young, someone who hadn't finished growing. It was tiny. There was nothing to measure, no shape worth comparing to anything. By every method science had used up to that point, that bone was a dead end. There was no question you could ask it, so they asked a different one. The fragment went to a lab in Leipzig, Germany, to a team that had spent years learning how to pull DNA out of ancient bone without ruining it. Nobody expected a surprise. Given where the cave is and when that layer was formed, there were only two reasonable answers. Either the bone belonged to a modern human, someone like us, or it belonged to a Neanderthal. Here's how you tell the difference. Think of DNA as a recipe that gets copied by hand, generation after generation. Every time it's copied, a few small mistakes slip in. A letter changes, and once a mistake is in, it stays in, and gets passed down to everyone who comes after. So if you have two copies of that recipe, you don't need to understand a word of it. You just count the differences. A few differences means the copies split apart recently. Thousands of differences means they've been separate for a very, very long time. Now, every one of your cells actually carries two separate sets of instructions. There's the big one, inherited from both your parents, and there's a much smaller one, passed down only from your mother. The small one came back first in early 2010, and it was neither answer. Not us. Not Neanderthal. The number of differences was enormous, enough to suggest these lines had been apart for something like 1 million years. But that small set of instructions is one thread out of an entire fabric. By the end of that same year, the team had read the big one, the rest of the genome, and with the whole picture, the relationship came into focus. They weren't some ancient stranger off on their own. They were the Neanderthals' closest relatives. The two of them a pair, both branching away from our line before they split from each other. Our lines are estimated to have separated somewhere between 550 and 765,000 years ago. They had no face, so they were named after the cave, the Denisovans, which raises the obvious question. What did they look like? At this point in the story, the honest answer was still nobody knew, but there was a different question that could be answered, and the answer was much bigger than anyone expected. In 1980, on the Tibetan plateau, a Buddhist monk walked into a cave to pray and found half of a lower jaw, two enormous molars still in it. Clearly human, and clearly not like any human alive. It sat essentially forgotten for nearly 40 years. When researchers finally examined it in 2019, The DNA was long gone. Too warm, too much time. So they tried something else. Proteins. Proteins survive longer than DNA, and they carry their own faint signature of who you were. The signature said Denisovan, at least 160,000 years old, more than 3,000 meters above sea level in thin, cold air. Then in 2025, another jaw. This one had been dragged up off the seafloor near Taiwan by a fishing boat, sold to an antique dealer, and only later handed to a museum. Proteins again. Denisovan again. This time a man, freezing Siberia, the roof of the world, and the warm, humid subtropics. This wasn't a group from a cave. This was a group spread across a continent. So the researchers tried something that sounded frankly like a waste of time. They compared the Denisovan genome to the DNA of people alive today. Nobody expected anything. A vanished population from a Siberian cave has nothing to do with anyone walking around in the 21st century. To understand why the comparison even works, you need one detail about how DNA gets passed down. It doesn't come to you as dust scattered and shuffled beyond recognition. It comes in long stretches, whole blocks of it, inherited intact. So if your ancestors mixed with another group, that DNA doesn't just dissolve into you. It sits in your genome as chunks that match an ancient genome and that are far too long to be a coincidence. The signal lit up. Not in Siberia, not in Europe, where it almost completely vanishes. It appeared thousands of kilometers south. In Papua New Guinea, in Aboriginal Australians. Estimates there run from roughly 1 to 5%, depending on how you measure it. The highest levels found anywhere in the world so far belong to a community in the Philippines, the Eta Magbukon. Across East and South Asia, it drops to a fraction of a single percent. That uneven map isn't a footnote. It's the record of where two kinds of people met. And the explanation for how it got there is almost disappointingly simple. They met. And they had children. When our ancestors moved out of Africa and into Asia, they did not walk into an empty world. They walked into somewhere that was already occupied by people who had been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. Somewhere along the way, the two groups found each other. After that, time went to work. With every generation, recombination broke those inherited stretches into smaller and smaller pieces. Over tens of thousands of years, many of those pieces disappeared. But not all of them. And this didn't happen once. The evidence points to at least 3 separate episodes of mixing, involving Denisovan groups so distinct from one another that if you met them, you might not think of them as the same people at all, which leaves an uncomfortable gap. All of that is inferred. It's statistics, patterns in numbers. Was there ever any direct proof? In 2012, another fragment came out of the ground at Denisova Cave. Nobody noticed it. It went into storage with more than 2,000 other scraps. Bone chips so small and broken that even specialists couldn't say whether they came from a human, a deer, or a hyena. 4 years later, a team ran all of them through a new kind of filter. Instead of looking at shape, they tested the proteins in each fragment, sorting animal from human. 2,000 pieces went in. 1 came back human. They ran a quick genetic check. What's that small set of instructions passed down from the mother? The result was clear. Neanderthal. Another Neanderthal bone in a cave that already had them. That should have been the end of it. Then in 2018 they sequenced the full genome. And it made no sense. It carried Neanderthal markers. It also carried Denisovan markers. Both. At the same time, in the same sample. The obvious explanation was that something had gone wrong. 2 individuals mixed together, or contamination in the lab. So they ran it again. And again. 6 separate extractions. The result held. This wasn't 2 people. It was 1. The bone belonged to a girl. She was at least 13 years old when she died, roughly 90,000 years ago. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan, not a distant descendant of some ancient mixing. The first generation. A child with 1 parent from each group. And the researchers made a point of what that implies. Out of the tiny handful of ancient individuals ever sequenced, we found a first-generation child. Their own conclusion was careful but clear. It suggests that when these groups met, interbreeding may not have been rare. Which brings us back to that jaw the monk found. The Tibetan plateau. Over 3,000 meters. Denisovans were living up there. Today on that same plateau, there are communities who have lived for generations in air so thin that most outsiders get sick within days. And the reason is stranger than it sounds. When a typical human body goes to high altitude, it responds by making more hemoglobin, the part of your blood that carries oxygen. More carriers, more oxygen. It seems sensible, except too much hemoglobin thickens the blood. And thick blood is dangerous. It raises the risk of heart trouble and of serious complications in pregnancy. The body is trying to save itself and hurting itself at the same time. Many Tibetans carry a different version of a stretch of DNA around a gene called EPAS1, the region that manages how the body reacts to low oxygen. People who carry it don't overproduce. Their blood stays thinner. The adaptation isn't extra power, it's not overreacting, and that version came from Denisovans or from a population very closely related to them. Now the part that's easy to get wrong. Tibetans do not carry more Denisovan DNA than other people. Across their whole genome, it's estimated at less than half of 1%. What they have is one specific piece. A piece that happened to be useful, so natural selection held onto it. The proof is in who doesn't have it. Papuans carry far more Denisovan ancestry overall. They don't carry this piece. At sea level, there was nothing to keep it. In 2019, a research team tried something that shouldn't work. They attempted to predict what a body looked like using only chemical markers sitting on its DNA. No skull, no skeleton, just the genome. They tested the method on species whose anatomy we already know, Neanderthals, chimpanzees. And it got the direction of change right more than 80% of the time. Then they pointed it at the Denisovans and published a prediction. A long face, a wide pelvis, a skull that widened out to the sides and a large dental arch. A prediction with nothing to check it against. Then in 2025, attention turned to a skull that had been sitting in the scientific hands for years. It was found near Harbin in northeastern China nearly a century ago, hidden away through a war, then brought back into the light. Almost complete, at least 146,000 years old. And nobody could say what it was. No DNA survived in the bone, but some survived in the hardened plaque on the man's teeth. At the same time, a second team read the proteins in the skull itself. Two independent methods. One answer. Denisovan. After 15 years of fragments, most researchers now accept that we finally have a face. A broad skull, large teeth. Close to what had been predicted 6 years earlier from DNA alone. And the moment that face appeared, something else did too. Looking inside the Denisovan genome, researchers found traces of yet another group. Older still, one that mixed with Denisovan ancestors long ago, and one we have never found a single bone from. A shadow inside a shadow. We tend to picture extinction as a door slamming shut. The last one dies and everything about them is gone. This didn't happen that way. It was less like a door closing and more like a river flowing into another river. Something real was lost. They ended as a distinct people. Nobody calls themselves Denisovan. Nobody lives the way they lived. If they had language, it's gone completely. We still don't know exactly when they disappeared or why, and something real remained. Not all of them. Not their voices or their names or whatever they thought about at night. Just pieces. But those pieces traveled through thousands of generations, and they're in millions of people who woke up this morning. One of those pieces is still helping people live in one of the most oxygen-starved environments on Earth. We had their genome before we had their face. Now we have both, and both say the same thing. Extinction usually means erasure. This time it didn't. They ended as a people, but they were never entirely undone. Parts of what they were are still being carried forward, in bodies they would not recognize, through a world they never saw.